It's now recording. 17 minutes. Almost 17 minutes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the afternoon session. Our next speaker will be my lecturer from this university.
Yes, thank you everybody. My presentation is on the strategic use of examples in supporting a positive evaluation of a political group as a whole. In fact, in my doctoral dissertation, I was interested in studying how political columnists strategically maneuvered in favor of democratization, paving the way to the Arab Spring. My main question was, how could the advocates who argued in favor of the desirability of political change in the Middle East maintain the delicate balance between committing to the norms of reasonableness and seeking for effectiveness? My starting point was that arguing in favor of democratization entails supporting the replacement of the political status quo system, totalitarian, autocratic, authoritarian, etc., by a new democratic one. This replacement can be considered as a change of policy at the national level. In debates on change of a policy, an advocate must convince his or her audience that taking an action to bring about this change is indispensable, or at least more desirable than maintaining the existing policy or system. In the literature on debate and advocacy, the call for an action is known as a proposition of policy, and the dispute over policy change is then analyzed from a stock issues perspective. Stock issues are hunting grounds for arguments. They provide a general phrasing of potential issues which correspond to the inherent logical obligations of the advocate of change. Since each of the stock issue categories correspond to a logical obligation of the advocate of policy change, each of these categories constitutes a vital area of concern, an area in which the advocate of change may logically lose his case. Advocates in favor of democratization anticipate their opponents to ask a group of critical questions related to the proposition concerned. Each question represents a stock issue that can be the topic of an argumentative text, a political column, a TV interview, etc. These issues are harm, inherency, alternative inherency, solvency, alternative solvency, cost, and feasibility. I focused on studying how La'laء الأسواني, a prominent columnist and a novelist of an international fame, maneuvers strategically in discussing the issue of feasibility as the main practical issue and therefore the most challenging issue to discuss. If democracy is desirable, is it really feasible to establish a new democratic system, which means that we must, as a people, oust the dictator first? I found out that Al-Aswani's discussion of the feasibility of political change in terms of democratization consisted of the discussion of three main topics. One of them is what I call the active people topic, that the Egyptian people have changed, becoming no longer politically inactive, submissive, or indifferent, so that they could participate in ousting Mubarak. Al-Aswani mainly uses argumentation from example supporting his claim, testing whether or not Al-Aswani could maintain the presumed balance between the dialectical reasonableness and the rhetorical effectiveness steers two research questions. First, what does it mean to commit to the norms of reasonableness in the case of using argumentation from example? And number two, what is the particular rhetorical exigency that Al-Aswani confronts in this specific case? Regarding the first question, argumentation theorists attempted to list the critical question that an antagonist or an opponent may ask in order to test the validity of argumentation from example. The protagonist should anticipate these questions and attempt to answer them as much satisfactorily as possible in adaptation to his audience demand. Being limited by time, I shall briefly present only two main insights into argumentation from example. Freire and Steinberg distinguish four types of reasoning: reasoning by example, reasoning by analogy, causal reasoning, and reasoning by sign. According to them, in order to test the validity of each type of reasoning, opponents may ask some questions that are relevant to the type of reasoning used. When using reasoning by example, the following questions serve as tests. 1, is the example relevant? Number 2, is there a reasonable number of examples? Number 3, do the examples cover a critical period of time? Number 4, are the examples typical? Number 5, are negative examples non-critical? The second insight is the pragmadialectical insight into argumentation from example. The pragmadialecticians distinguish only 3 types of reasoning that each have their own argument schemes: argumentation by comparison, causal argumentation, and symptomatic argumentation. A basic subtype of symptomatic argumentation is argumentation from example, in which separate facts are represented as special cases of something general. On the basis of specific perceptions, a generalization is made. I'm here quoting from Parthars. To test the validity of symptomatic argumentation, pragmadialecticians suggest that the basic critical question is whether the characteristic at issue is indeed typical of the property concerned. In the case of the subtype of argumentation from example, the question is reformulated to be: are the specific cases typical for the state of affairs? The protagonist thus should anticipate that the antagonist may stir questions concerning the representativeness and sufficiency of the examples. Are the separate cases indeed representative, and have sufficient separate cases been considered? If the protagonist fails to answer these 2 questions appropriately, the fallacy of hasty generalization is committed. Although Freely and Steinberg's list seems useful and detailed, as they highlight more aspects of testing the validity of reasoning by example, their questions represent the articulation of the representativeness and sufficiency questions. The first, third, and fourth questions are different manifestations of the question concerning the representativeness of the example cited. The multitude of questions related to the representativeness of examples, which Freely and Steinberg suggest, can be justified by the fact that the conclusions supported by examples are sometimes multifaceted, and therefore the representativeness manifests itself in relevance, typicality, and time. Discussants are thus expected to make sure that the examples used represent the conclusion in all its facets. The second and fifth questions suggested by Freely and Steinberg are complementing each other in testing the sufficiency of the examples used. In many cases, negative examples supporting the counter-conclusion exist. Advocates must prove that the positive examples are enough and considerably weigh the negative examples, for example, by framing them as exceptional cases. Regarding the second question on the particular rhetorical exigency Al-Aswani is willing to overcome in these specific cases, it's indeed challenging for an arguer to convince an audience that a whole group of people have changed. Specifically, when this group is so huge, it's 90 million people, and thus makes it always possible that negative examples exist, refuting the sufficiency of the examples cited. And in addition, when an arguer is confronted with an established negative image of this group. As a developing country, Mubarak's Egypt depended so much on consent since the cost of using coercion only would be relatively high. I'm here following the Gramscian differentiation between consent and coercion. As a rule, an autocratic regime does not only attempt at convincing the people that their leader is great or exceptionally qualified, but also that they, as a people, will never be able to make a change because they are helpless and inactive, and more importantly, innately bad. The greatness of the ruler and the littleness of the people are 2 sides of the same coin in this type of regimes. The regime established a prolonged strategy aimed at projecting such a bad image of the people onto themselves. A strategy that consisted of various tactics, for example, to stereotype the politically active person as a very individualistic and very isolated as well. So they are a little number of people, and they are isolated because they are quite strange. I will now give a more detailed description of the argumentative predicament confronting Al-Aswani in using arguments from example while addressing the active people topic. In political communication, examples are frequently used to support a positive or negative evaluation of a political actor. Excerpts of what a politician said or selections of what he or she did are advanced as a defense backing such a positive or negative evaluation. When it comes to evaluating a political group as a whole, the actions of members are provided as examples which are generalized to convey how the group typically acts. Following the ideal model of a critical discussion as a theoretical framework, this kind of argumentative practice can be described as follows. The protagonist supports his standpoint, evaluation Y is true of political group X, by putting forward arguments from example. Evaluation Y is true of group member X, 1, 2, 3, and N. As a rule, each of these arguments is in turn supported by citing some actions of the group member that convey the evaluation concerned. Member X, 1 or 2 or 3 or N does so and so. The examples together provide a coordinative support of the generalization included in the standpoint. In order to be considered by the antagonist as acceptable, these examples must be representative and sufficient. When examples are given to evaluate a group of people as a whole, the liberals, the conservative, or even a people as a whole, the question of representative becomes difficult to answer. To what extent can the antagonist consider the action or actions attributed to a group member representative of how a whole group acts, let alone the concomitance between the action and the evaluation? It becomes more difficult when arguers are so limited by space or time that they have to select a few examples. Then their opponents may cast doubt on the sufficiency of the few examples cited. In addressing the active people topic, Al-Aswani aims to provide a positive evaluation of a very wide political group, the Egyptian people. Selecting argumentation from example as a type of reasoning, he is confronted by the following challenging question. A. What actions of which Egyptian individuals can be cited as representative and sufficient examples which yield the evaluation concerned? In answering this question, Al-Aswani is constrained by the space of a political column, but he can also make use of the fact that a political column comes into being as a comment on a current event, and that a political column is implementing two different genres simultaneously: information dissemination and deliberation. In view of this fact, the question can be paraphrased as follows. B. Which aspects of which current event can Al-Aswani select to comment on in order to address the active people topic, answering question A as much appropriately as possible? As an illustrative case study, I will analyze in this presentation only one of Al-Aswani's columns entitled Egypt Awakened. It's a column tackling the return of Muhammad al-Barad'i, the former director of the International Atomic Energy Agency and a prominent promoter of political change before 2011. His return to Egypt, and how he was warmly welcomed by thousands of Egyptians in Cairo airport. The thousands of Egyptians who conquered their fear of suppression were presented by Al-Aswani as a particular case that can be generalized to establish a role concerning the Egyptian people as a whole. He writes, "From now on, no one can accuse the Egyptians of being passive, submissive to injustice, disengaged from public affairs, or any other of those claims that no longer reflect the reality of Egypt." Anticipating critical questions casting doubt on the representativeness and sufficiency of the cases cited, Al-Aswani utilizes his position as an eyewitness to prove the representativeness of the cases cited, highlighting different aspects of a variety of the Egyptians who gathered at the airport. He writes, "They were very ordinary Egyptians, like our neighbors or our colleagues at work, and they came from different provinces and different social classes. Some of them came in luxury cars, and many came by public transport. They included university professors, professionals, students, farmers, writers, artists, and housewives, Muslim and Copts, women with and without veils, and some wearing niqab." Perelman and Protestatica pay attention to the role of variety in strengthening representativeness. When one wishes to clarify a rule with many different applications, it is good to provide examples that are as different as possible, as by doing so it can be shown that the differences are without importance on this occasion. Knowing he is limited by space, Al-Aswani makes use of what Perelman and Ulbricht Aesthetica called resort to the hierarchically arranged examples as an attempt to strengthen the sufficiency of the examples cited. I here quote, instead of merely cumulating a number of different examples, a speaker will sometimes strengthen the argumentation by example by resorting to the double hierarchy argument, which makes a fortiori reasoning possible. Al-Aswani employs the hierarchy of ordinary citizens versus politicians or those who are typical politically active. The stereotype of a political activist manifested itself basically in the mass media and the cinema in a male university student who is insistently depicted as individualistic, liberal, and slightly intellectual. The prototypical expression of reaching the peak of activism in opposition politics is the act of demonstrating, in which dozens of university male students are involved. When members of the latter group, I mean the typically politically active, are engaged in political events like the one Al-Aswani comments on, it's plausible that the message conveyed is pertinent to the characteristics of this particular group. But when ordinary Egyptians who evoke the image of the typical Egyptian participate in such events, it becomes more plausible that the message conveyed is pertinent to the Egyptian people as a whole. The relevance of the following three fragments, or perhaps scenes, the relevance of these scenes to the argumentation advanced can be thus grasped. An old woman came up to me and asked me to speak to me in private. I took her aside and in a low voice she asked me, "Do you think the government will do anything to harm Dr. al-Baradei?" When I assured her that this was most unlikely, she sighed with relief and said, "May God protect him." I will not forget the man who came with his wife and their pretty little girl with 2 plates, who sat on his shoulders carrying a picture of al-Baradei. I will not forget the dignified woman in the hijab, the good-hearted Egyptian mother who brought with her several packets of fine dates. She opened them one after the other and started to give them out to people standing around that she did not know. When someone said no thank you, she gave them an angry look, then smiled and said, "You must eat something. You have been on your feet all day and you must be hungry. Please have some." These 3 scenes can be understood as related to the anticipated critical questions on representativeness and sufficiency. By giving the examples of an old woman, a pair of parents, and a traditional mother or family member showing parental-like emotions and practices, Al-Aswani implies that the examples cited represent typical Egyptians. And if the most ordinary could conquer their fear, then those who occupied higher notes of the hierarchy would possibly do the same, so that the sufficiency may be enhanced as well. The same technique, I mean resort to the hierarchically arranged examples, is applied in terms of the action cited, welcoming al-Baradei at the airport. By framing the welcoming as unsafe and surrounded by threats, Al-Aswani implies that the Egyptian people will be perhaps more politically active when it comes to safer activities. Al-Aswani benefits from the fact that a political columnist implements the genre of information dissemination as well as that of deliberation to frame the action of welcoming as an adventure. The Interior Ministry detained several young people simply for urging Egyptians to go out and welcome him. The security agencies also made it clear that they would not allow Egyptians to rally to greet al-Baradei at the airport and announced that they had mobilized 8,000 raid police to deal with anyone who gathered there. These unofficial statements were leaked and some independent newspapers published them on their front pages in the same form on the morning al-Baradei arrived in Egypt. How this group of Egyptians is positioned by means of linguistic choices is also relevant to Al-Aswani's attempt at strengthening the representativeness and sufficiency of the examples he uses. As for representativeness, the participants in the welcoming activity are referred to as merely Egyptians 5 times and as supporters of al-Baradei in this context only once. And as for sufficiency, they are referred to as hundreds once and as thousands 6 times. The answer of the aforementioned questions can now be given. Question number B. Which aspects of a current event